Hello everyone, Southern Mike here with Haunted Empath. Today I want to tell you a story about when I was a apprentice mortician many years ago and what that was like. I started when I was very young, just out of high school. Actually, I graduated high school early, ahead of my class, and a friend of mine told me about the opening at the local funeral home. So I had many experiences handling people and the deceased, being a volunteer fireman. So I applied and was accepted. And I remember my very first day at the funeral home. I didn't know what to expect. I thought I'd just be doing some, cleaning and things like that. So on my first day, I show up, I walk in, and they said, okay, we want you to vacuum these rooms. And these were rooms where the deceased was laid out in their caskets and everything. And they told me to get the vacuum out of the closet, which I did, and I started vacuuming the room, of course looking around as I was doing that. And then within 10 minutes in, the funeral director comes to me and says, look, we're going to need you in the back room to help the mortician out that's back there. And I applied for apprentice mortician, and in the state I was in at that time, you had to get a college degree in mortuary science, and you had to do a year apprentice, and that's what I was starting. So I put the vacuum away and went back to the end of the building where the embalming room was, and I walked in. And so when I walked into the room, I saw there was a body laying on the embalming table, and the mortician was standing there with this white lab coat on. So he tells me to take my jacket off, because we had to wear suits, and put a lab coat on and give him a hand. So which I did. So I put the lab coat on, a pair of gloves, and that's all the protection we had back then, was a lab coat and gloves. We didn't have anything else. We didn't even wear masks. So I followed his instructions, and he was showing me what he needed me to do, and I followed his directions, and I started working with the deceased right then and there, about 15 minutes into my first day on the job. So he was instructing me and teaching me how to embalm a deceased person, and which I followed his instructions. And we worked on the person probably a good 2 hours. I really don't want to go into a lot of detail of the procedure. You can probably find that somewhere else on YouTube. But we dressed the person, and we picked them up and carried them across the room in our arms and laid them into the casket. A few days later, the funeral was held for this person, and I was to drive the limousine with the family in it. And I was instructed to stay at least 12 feet behind the hearse when it pulls up at the cemetery. That way it gives them room to open the door and maneuver the casket to the gravesite, which I did. I had the family, and I drove up. I stopped 12 feet behind the casket. I got out, walked around. They opened the door for the family, and found out that I was parked right next to a telephone pole, which I couldn't open the door. So I had to go back around, get back in, back up further, past the telephone pole, get back out, and then let them out of the vehicle. And I was also instructed at that time that when the funeral was over, to take the family, get them back into the limousine, and exit the cemetery as soon as possible, which I did. On that day, that was the only person we had that we worked on. The next day I came into work, and the embalming room was filled with people. We had probably 5 deceased people in the room. Well, we only had 2 tables, so the other people were laying on other tables that rolled into the room. So I was learning more and more as time went on. I would sew up the person and things like that. But what I noticed was that the person laying on the table really wasn't a person. You could tell, at least I could tell, that it was just a shell or a body, that the soul has already gone and that's all was left. That's what I was sensing. That's what I was feeling. That it was just a shell. It wasn't the person that everyone knew at the time. Now the pay, I would say, was terrible. Of course, I had just turned 18 years old, and my pay was $2.50 an hour, and I was working 12-hour days. I would go home and could be called in later that evening to go to a hospital morgue or the state morgue, or to a funeral home or hospital, or to a family's home and pick up a loved one at any given time. And you're talking at least several more hours just to go to the funeral home, pick up the hearse, and then go to your location to pick the person up. So I was working long hours for $2.50 an hour. So I'm sure today that the pay is a lot better. And again, I was apprentice. So when I came to work, first thing I would smell would be the flowers in all the different rooms where people were laid out. And then as I got back into the area of the embalming room, the smell would change. It would turn into a smell of embalming fluid. And that smell just kind of stays with you. You know, once you smell it, you know what it is. And again, I had to wear a suit every day, long hours, and just finishing high school, it just wasn't enough money. You know, I had a car payment, car insurance, and things like that. You know, food, just like anybody else would have. Do you know what the difference is between a cemetery and a graveyard? I mean, a lot of people, and I can understand it, think they're the same. They're just different names, but they're actually not. A graveyard is connected to a church. You see a church in graves, that's a graveyard because it's a church. The cemetery has no church. It's just a field with graves. So that's the difference there. You know, back in the day, before they had these concrete vaults that they put into the ground, what would happen is when they buried somebody without a vault, over time, the grave would just sink in, because as the casket and everything disintegrates, the ground just sinks in, and it was causing a trip hazard. You'd be walking along the cemetery and just trip and fall because the ground was sunken in. So they came up with the vault. The vault keeps the ground from sinking in because it fills up the space, makes it solid, so you wouldn't have that hazard. So after time, I wound up resigning, strictly because the pay just wasn't there. So I wound up taking a job with the government, a lot more money, benefits, and shorter hours for sure. While I was working full-time for the government, I picked up a part-time job working at another local funeral home. Now the hard part about that was that I would work my full-time job, then on my days off I would work at the funeral home, and then even when I worked all day, I'd be on call at night. So I might get a phone call at midnight or 1 o'clock saying, hey, we need you to go to this funeral home. So after working a full-time job, you know, I was on call, so they could call me up at 1 o'clock in the morning and say, we need you to go to this nursing home to pick up this person, or this house to pick up this person. And I would get out of bed, put my suit on that I left hanging there, and then I'd have to drive to the funeral home. I had the combination for the alarm to turn it off, and then I'd have to go in, get the cot, get the sheets. And what's really kind of was spooky, because I would walk in the middle of the night pitch black, and I would flip the light on, and there'd be a body laying in front of me on the embalming table. I would have to reach over the person and get the clean sheets and everything for the cot. And I was the only one there, and a pitch black, funeral home at night. So it was spooky. I would then go to the garage, get the hearse out, and might have to travel an hour, 2 hours to the nursing home, pick the person up, and then come back to the funeral home. And I would just bring the person in and leave it for the morning shift to come in and do the embalming. And then I would go home, get as much sleep as I could, because I had to get up and go to my full-time job in the morning. So at that time, I would get $75 for just picking the person up and bringing them back to the funeral home. But again, it might be an hour and a half, 2 hours of work, and you're getting up in the middle of the night. The one mortician I was working with, he was a young person that just got his license, and he was telling me that he had never experienced death, that no one in his family, because he's a young guy, no one in his family has ever died, and he didn't know anybody personally that had died. But he was doing this job, which is fine. But I often wonder, would he have changed his mind if he had known someone close to him that had died? I guess we'll never know that answer, because I don't know. So after a while, I left there because it was just too much for working full time and getting out of bed and working all night. So I left there. So I wanted to share that experience. It was creepy at times when you're walking into a funeral home pitch black and there's bodies laying around. So I wanted to share that experience, and I hope you enjoyed it. So please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next adventure.